morning. We've got John Kingston joining us, our editor-at-large. John was also with us here in Chattanooga and didn't get to talk about this issue, even though it is a hot button to the freight industry. John, we've got our next steps in the battle between California and its AB5 law. What's going on there now?
Well, today's the day. They come back into court for the first time. As far as I can tell, they had one hearing in like 2018 or 2019. And the only other time the lawyers squared off over this was in a virtual session before the three-member appellate panel. That was right after Labor Day 2020. And now we're back in court. And we are back in court over the California Trucking Association's request, along with OOIDA, which is a intervener on behalf of the CTA, for yet a new injunction to keep AB5 out of trucking in California. So what I wrote a story on Friday was went through the briefs that were filed by OOIDA and the CTA and the Teamsters, and the Teamsters is an intervener on behalf of the state on why there should or should not be yet another injunction. So one argument is that there should be an injunction for the same reason that there was an injunction the last time. But let's remember that injunction was overturned by that panel that I mentioned, and then the Supreme Court chose not to review it. The argument there is that the Federal Aviation Administration Authorization Act, the so-called F4A, really bans this kind of activity by a state because it might affect interstate trucking routes, prices, and services. So there's that argument. The other argument that the lawyers for the CTA and OOIDA are making are ones that have popped up in either from a few years ago or recent months, that this impact interstate commerce, what's called the Dormant Commerce Clause. Also that the trucking industry is being unfairly singled out. There are 100 or more exemptions of other industries that AB5 doesn't apply to, and that they cite the comments of Lorena Gonzalez, who was the then Assemblywoman who was really the driving force behind AB5, that seemed to indicate that both gig drivers and truck drivers were the main focus. So there were those arguments. There really wasn't anything shockingly new in the briefs, except that they cited a story I wrote. I almost fell out of my chair. I'm reading along and I see the citation that says Kingston, and I thought, what is this? And this is a story from 2.5 years ago, and they cited it. So that was the only really surprise. They'll be coming up today at 12:30 Eastern Time, 9:30. I still don't know whether the audio of this is going to be broadcast, but we'll see what happens today. I don't think anybody expects a sudden new injunction, but let's remember that the judge that handed down the injunction the first time, Judge Roger Benitez, is once again the judge in this case. Remember that when the Supreme Court denied it, it didn't go away. It just kicked back to the original federal district court in the Southern District of California. So it's the same judge that handed down the injunction the first time.
Our very own editor-at-large going big time with this story. John, we're looking at AB5. For those that may not, for any reason, understand or know what's going on, can you talk to some of the aspects of ABC testing and really that B prong and why this is so important?
Yeah, thanks. The ABC test is a three-pronged test that is used by courts or government agencies, regulatory agencies, to determine whether a worker is a independent contractor or should be considered an employee. The B prong says that a worker can be an independent contractor if they are engaged in activity that is not the usual activity of the person that hires them. So if a trucking company hires janitors to clean the offices at night, obviously the trucking company is not primarily a janitorial company, so that's no issue. If they hire truck drivers to move freight when their business is primarily moving freight, then that would lean toward the idea that they'd be employees. It is considered highly restrictive and not very flexible at all. And the concern here is that the B prong would require, and this is really, these arguments are in the briefs, would require trucking companies to stop using the independent contractors and instead turn everybody into employees. The state says that is not true. They cite several things. Where they cited my story was a piece I did about 2.5 years ago on the business-to-business exception. Nowhere, we don't have anywhere near enough time to talk about it, but it is viewed as a way to allow independent contractors to be hired. The trucking industry says it's a 12-point step. You got to hit all 12 points. Nobody's ever going to be able to use it. And the state says, yes, you can. So that's the ABC test in a nutshell. Now, I think I sent you, I don't know if you got to put that chart up. but I did pull down a chart of the outbound tender rejection index for Los Angeles. It's in the story, and it shows that the OTRI, which of course is a reflection of capacity, has not really diverged that much from the national rate since July 1st, 2022, which is when the Supreme Court denied certiorari and AB5 effectively became the law of the state. So right now, I will say that they didn't cite the OTRI, but I will say that the state does have on its, to its argument, the fact that there is no sign of chaos in California trucking yet, even though AB5 has been in effect for well over a year. I will tell you that one thing that people note out there is that they keep looking for some big enforcement action by the state against some companies, some trucking companies over AB5, and they have yet to see it. So everybody's kind of waiting for this big action that might get taken, and so far that has not occurred.
That's a great point, John. It seems like everybody was kind of waiting for the other shoe to drop, right? And we had this big assertion that there was going to be a mass exodus at one point in time, I think it was being called, of these independent owner-operators out of California because they simply didn't want to go through the headaches or have the possibility of them not being employed. As you mentioned, there's been no enforcement. There's been no mass exodus that's occurred. Do you think that it takes maybe a year and a half to 2 years before we see this play out, either in the reporting, how these drivers are now reported to the state, in taxes or things like that, or before we see these actual cases in litigation play out, which would be kind of that main way of enforcement?
Yeah, I just want to focus on your word litigation because I think it's important. Even though everybody's looking for, the big bang, right? The big enforcement action that the state undertakes, and they put out a press release and they drag people to court. It's a really big deal, okay? But as has been noted to me, this thing is also likely to pop up in just some suits by some aggrieved drivers, some civil suits, aggrieved drivers against a company. Because there's a whole body of law of those anyway. Of course, you should have classified us as drivers, as employees, and AB5 is the reason. So that doesn't get really the headlines as much. We and the journalists who cover this have to discover that those cases exist. Haven't heard of any yet. But so it's not just necessarily going to be when it does make its way into the courts, it's not necessarily going to be just a big action, a headline-grabbing action. It can also be a significant part of much kind of smaller level litigation. But at the same time, that smaller level litigation can establish legal precedents that can then be used in the future in lawsuits over an independent contractor status.
And John, we didn't get to chat anything about oil or diesel this episode, or this segment, I should say. But for those that want to catch more of your content or maybe see a little bit more about that side of you, when and where can they do that?
Well, let's remember that today is Monday, and Monday is the day in which the EIA benchmark diesel price comes out. We'll have a story on it, as we do every Monday. I did post a tweet over the weekend. I got some data on OPEC Plus production from S&P Global Commodities Insight, which is where I used to work when it was known as Platts, when part of it was known as Platts. And the chart's it's in my Twitter feed, and you can see the way OPEC Plus production has been rising the last 3 to 4 months. Several 100,000 barrels a day. On top of that, you put higher output from places like the U.S. and Guyana and Brazil. And, I'm not saying you're dealing with a surplus, but you've got a market that is going to be hard pressed to make $100 a barrel Brent, which was the assumption over the summer was we're going to 100, we're going to 100. We never went to 100. Coming into today, we were closer to 81. And, the world right now is, sitting on some pretty decent amount of crude. Inventories are rising, and you've got a fair amount of spare capacity sitting on the side. So the crisis, for now, may be okay. Let's pray for a warm winter. Pray for a warm winter.
There you go. Warm winter, fingers crossed. All right, John, thank you for joining us this morning. We'll talk to you soon.
Thank you.
All right, we're going to go ahead and take a quick break. We'll be right back with more Freight Waves Now right after this.